The sea is an unforgiving domain. It is a battlefield where hubris is punished with swift and brutal finality. For months, it seemed an impossible task to challenge the massive naval superiority of one of the world's most powerful military forces. The Black Sea had become a Russian lake, patrolled by a behemoth, a symbol of dominance known only as the floating fortress. Yet Ukraine, a nation with virtually no standing navy, found a way. Their plan was audacious, relying not on superior firepower, but on superior patience and a chilling understanding of human psychology. They waited. They watched. They meticulously tracked their target, waiting for the one moment no military planner can truly guard against, the moment of celebration. This is the story of a military intelligence coup, a strategy that leveraged a lapse in focus, turning a Russian moment of triumph into a spectacular and strategically devastating defeat. This is how Ukraine waited for Russian commanders to celebrate, and then struck the heart of Russia's Black Sea Fleet. To understand the magnitude of this achievement, we must first understand the target. The floating fortress was more than just a warship. It was the ultimate expression of Russian power projection in the region. It served as the central command and control hub for the entire naval operation. Its mere presence was a shield, a psychological deterrent that told Kiev, the sea belongs to us. Equipped with layered defense systems, advanced radar, multiple anti-air batteries, and massive anti-ship missile capability, it was designed to be virtually unsinkable. The Russian doctrine around such a vessel was simple: keep it moving, keep its crew alert, and keep its systems running. For a nation with limited offensive naval capacity like Ukraine, attacking it was considered a suicide mission. Its role was critical. It was instrumental in coordinating coastal shelling, maintaining the naval blockade, and providing air cover for smaller ships. Losing this vessel would not just be losing a ship, it would be crippling the entire operational integrity of the Black Sea Fleet. Ukraine's reality in the early stages of the conflict was one of asymmetric warfare. They could not meet Russia ship for ship. Instead, they adapted. Their strategy was built on three pillars: intelligence, adaptability, and improvised weaponry. The initial defense involved shore-based missiles and the innovative use of small, affordable, and often unmanned maritime drones. But to strike a target of this size, they needed a perfect opportunity. The fortress was too well protected when operating under standard combat protocols. Its radar cross-section was immense, but its defensive bubble was too hard to pierce. The military maxim is clear: a ship at high alert is almost impossible to destroy. But a ship whose crew is distracted, whose watch shifts are complacent, whose commanders are preoccupied with ceremony rather than threat assessment, that ship is uniquely vulnerable. This is where the operation moved from a military challenge to an intelligence puzzle. The objective shifted from finding the ship to finding the moment of weakness. Analysts in Kiev and their international partners began to meticulously study the ship's pattern of life. When did it anchor? How often did it turn off its main search radars? When did commanders come and go? What emerged was a clear pattern of operational security lapses, the slow, creeping effect of months at sea. And then, the intelligence community picked up a faint, but critical signal. Chatter suggesting a major, morale-boosting event was being planned. A celebration. Perhaps a successful mission return, a high-ranking visit, or a key Russian holiday. For Ukraine's planners, this was not a hindrance. It was the operational window they had been waiting for. The celebration meant the crew would be relaxed. The command structure would be centralized and temporarily distracted. The defensive alertness would drop from 100% to dangerously low levels. Ukraine had the weapon, but now they had the catalyst. They just had to wait for the party to start. To appreciate the scale of Ukraine's ultimate ambition, we must first map out the theater of war, the Black Sea chessboard. Historically, this water has been a crucial geopolitical junction, a gateway for trade, and a stage for imperial ambition. But by the start of the full-scale invasion, the pieces were fundamentally mismatched. Russia's Black Sea Fleet was a formidable force, centuries in the making. Its objectives were clear: impose a total naval blockade, isolate Ukraine's southern coastline, and project power deep into the country through cruise missile strikes launched from the safety of international waters. For months, they achieved a state of near-total Black Sea dominance. Their vessels sailed with impunity, confident in their numbers and their layered anti-air defenses. Ukraine, by contrast, had its naval capacity dramatically reduced early on, forcing the painful realization that they could not compete on Russian terms. The fight could not be one of direct confrontation. It had to become one of asymmetric warfare. They surrendered the idea of controlling the sea and focused instead on the far more achievable goal of denying the sea to their enemy. The strategy was simple in its execution, but revolutionary in its implication. Turn the Black Sea coast into a deadly no-go zone. Ukraine pulled their meager naval resources back and placed their faith in coastal defense. Land-based anti-ship missiles became the centerpiece. These were the long-range, hidden artillery that could fire and fade, challenging Russian vessels without ever risking a Ukrainian ship. The pivotal shift was not in the hardware, however, but in the military strategy. Ukraine began to weaponize information and terrain. They used the coast, the weather, and a complex network of surveillance, both conventional and crowdsourced, to create a digital kill chain. Early successes, often against smaller, more vulnerable Russian craft, served a crucial purpose beyond the tactical victory. They shattered the Russian sense of untouchability. They forced the mighty Black Sea Fleet to move further from shore, thus reducing its effectiveness and exposing its logistical tail. But the core problem remained: the floating fortress. This ship was the anchor of the entire Russian naval position. It was too fast, too well defended, and too politically significant to be hunted by conventional means. It was the command and control hub, the electronic brain coordinating the entire fleet's movements, and the air defense for its smaller escorts. As long as it sailed, Russia's Black Sea dominance was functionally intact. Its destruction would send ripples far beyond the military sphere. It would be a psychological warfare victory, an unmistakable signal that no Russian asset, no matter how powerful or symbolic, was truly safe. This was the king piece on the chessboard, and the entire game hinged on finding a way to take it. The crew of the fortress, accustomed to being the hunter, grew complacent in their superiority. They believed their sheer size and complex defense systems rendered them immune to any retaliatory strike from a nation they had dismissed as having no navy. And in this complacency, the Ukrainian intelligence agencies saw not a defense, but a vulnerability. The planning for the strike took months, built on thousands of small, granular pieces of intelligence gathering. Analysts meticulously tracked the fortress's sail routes, the timing of its electronic emissions, the deployment of its smaller escort vessels, and critically, its return-to-port schedules. They were mapping the difference between theoretical defense and actual readiness. The intelligence suggested a pattern. The most relaxed state of the crew often coincided with a post-mission stand-down, a period when the intensity of battle was replaced by the relief and routine of rest and celebration. This was not just tracking a ship, it was predicting human behavior under the stress of war. They were waiting for the moment when the commanders, feeling safe within their floating fortress, would momentarily drop their guard. This psychological aperture, this small window of celebratory laxity, became the single most important variable in the entire operation. The entire strike plan was now being built around a date that was not a military objective, but a Russian holiday, a success, or a party. The destruction of the floating fortress was not a moment of chance. It was the result of a meticulously planned intelligence operation. The mission's initial phase was a deep dive into ISR, intelligence, surveillance, and reconnaissance. This was not a quick surveillance mission. It was the creation of a comprehensive data profile. Ukraine's command, supported by crucial data streams from international partners, began charting every discernible detail of the flagship's existence. SIGINT, Signals Intelligence, monitored its electronic output, when its main radars spun up, when its electronic warfare, EW, systems were active, and critically, the timing of its routine internal communications. GeoInt, Geospatial Intelligence, used satellite imagery and long-range drones to map its common anchorages, its typical defensive posture, and the formation of its escorts. The goal was to establish a perfect pattern of life. They wanted to know the ship's pulse, when it beat fastest during high alert, and when it slowed during periods of routine. The intelligence was crystal clear. For weeks, the routine was rigid, the ship's OPSEC was formidable, and any attempt at a direct strike would result in the loss of expensive munitions for little return. The ship was a textbook high-value target, HVT, and it knew it. If the ship's technical defenses could not be bypassed, the planners understood they had to target the human element. The only defense that can never be perfect is the crew itself. In a combat zone, the greatest enemy after the opposition is complacency. The human mind struggles to maintain peak alertness against a threat that never materializes. After weeks of sailing with unchallenged Black Sea dominance, the rigorous standards of command and control inevitably began to fray. Intelligence reports indicated a subtle but measurable decline in defensive protocols, particularly when the vessel returned to a perceived safe zone or after a lengthy deployment. The analysts looked for moments where routine replaced readiness. They sought evidence of a psychological lapse, a predictable slowdown in the rotation of radar operators, the reduced intensity of roving patrols, the shift in focus from immediate threat assessment to administrative duties or crew welfare. The operational planners realized that the strike's success would not be determined by the speed of their missile, but by the delay in the Russian crew's reaction time. They needed not just a hole in the ship's defenses, but a hole in the crew's attention. This analysis led to a chilling, yet brilliant strategic decision. The Ukrainian planners made a conscious choice to wait for an operational weakness they had never been granted before. They decided to postpone the strike until they had confirmed intel of a major, planned lapse in OPSEC, specifically a celebration. The logic was undeniable. A celebration, a holiday, a commemoration, a morale-boosting visit, would guarantee a cascade of desirable tactical conditions. First, a large number of senior personnel, including the command staff, would be centralized, distracted, and possibly off-duty. Second, the necessary ceremonial functions would require a reduction of the ship's readiness level. And third, the psychological guard of the entire crew would be at its lowest point. The order was given. Target acquisition would shift from a 24/7 pursuit to a patient, meticulous hunt for this specific human factor. The entire operation became a high-stakes waiting game. They were not waiting for the weather to clear or for the ship to sail closer. They were waiting for the moment when the Russian commanders would decide, themselves, that the threat was over. While the waiting game commenced, the technical side of the plan was finalized. The weapon chosen needed to be fast, low-flying, and capable of inflicting catastrophic damage against a heavily armored hull. This was a clear role for advanced anti-ship cruise missiles, such as the indigenous Neptune, or a synchronized swarm of innovative maritime drones, or perhaps a combination of both. The plan was refined to a level of surgical precision. The strike had to be timed to hit during the peak of the celebration, when the vessel's defense systems would be at their most sluggish. The impact zones were calculated to maximize secondary explosions, targeting the fuel stores, the missile magazines, and the centralized command and control structure. The entire blueprint was complete. They had the target, they had the weapon, and now, the entire Ukrainian military intelligence community held its breath, simply waiting for the invitations to the enemy's party to be issued. The strategic patience of waiting for the celebration window was matched by the technical audacity of the weapon system chosen. To defeat the floating fortress, Ukraine required an indigenous solution, the R-360 Neptune anti-ship cruise missile. Developed domestically, the Neptune was designed specifically for one task: to counter the superior naval power of the Black Sea Fleet. Its key characteristic was its flight profile. The Neptune is a sea-skimming missile. It flies only a few meters above the wavetops, using the Earth's natural curvature and the radar horizon as its primary cloak. This ultra-low trajectory makes it incredibly difficult for the enemy's main search radars to acquire it until the missile is almost upon them. For the commanders on board the target, an approaching Neptune would appear almost instantaneously. However, even the Neptune was not enough alone. The fortress possessed multiple layers of defense: long-range radar, sophisticated electronic warfare, EW, jamming capabilities, and short-range defense systems. A lethal combination of close-in guns and anti-missile interceptors. To succeed, the strike needed to be a calculated act of saturation. The brilliance of the execution lay in its orchestration of distraction. The plan was to create a scenario where the ship's defenders were forced to look in the wrong direction at the wrong time. This is where the concept of asymmetric warfare reached its pinnacle. The main assault would be the precision strike of the Neptune missiles, but the attack would be preceded or accompanied by a sophisticated decoy effort. This could involve a swarm of low-cost, expendable maritime drones launched from a different vector. Their primary goal was not to damage the ship, but to trigger and confuse the fortress's defensive systems. The drones, emitting electronic signatures designed to mimic larger threats, would force the Russian crew to allocate their limited time and resources to fighting what they thought was the primary attack. This would saturate the radar operators, confuse the targeting computers, and crucially, pull the attention of the short-range guns away from the missile's true attack vector. The timing of the strike was set to coincide with the most vulnerable hour of the celebration. The intelligence suggested a precise moment when the command and control structure would be centralized and the crew rotation at its slackest. The attack was designed to exploit known limitations in naval defense. The Neptune missiles were to strike the vessel from a specific angle, calculated to impact the ship's weakest points, the side containing the fuel bunkers and the ammunition magazines. The goal was not merely to punch a hole in the hull, but to initiate a catastrophic damage event through secondary explosions. The mission briefing was intense. The crews at the coastal launch sites were under immense pressure. The strike was a one-shot opportunity. If they failed, the vessel would be on high alert, and the cost of the misfire would be strategically immense. The final clearance depended on an almost simultaneous confirmation that the targets were locked, the decoy assets were deployed, and most importantly, the intelligence signal confirming that the Russian commanders were indeed celebrating their perceived safety, that the party was in full swing. Under the cover of night, or a carefully selected weather pattern, the launch sequence began. With the final orders confirmed, the massive booster engines of the Neptune missiles ignited, sending the deadly projectiles climbing quickly, only to level off barely above the waves. Silent to the crew of the floating fortress, the weapons were now hurtling toward their target. The drones began their chaotic, distracting maneuvers. The Russian defense systems, still likely operating on a lower state of readiness due to the festivities on board, began to register the incoming swarm, but the timing was against them. For the Ukrainian crews, there was now only a tense, agonizing wait. The missiles were running their automated flight paths, locked onto the coordinates delivered by meticulous intelligence. They had done everything possible to neutralize the technical threat. Now the success of the entire, months-long operation rested on a single factor: the speed and effectiveness of the Russian crew's celebratory hangover. For weeks, the entire mission had hung in the balance, waiting for the one variable outside of Ukraine's control to align: the moment of Russian vulnerability. Then, the intelligence streams confirmed the trigger. SIGINT, Signals Intelligence, picked up increased internal chatter related to logistical changes, the movement of non-essential personnel, and most tellingly, explicit communication confirming a high morale event. Whether it was a significant Russian national holiday, the successful return from a major combat sortie, or a change of command ceremony, the details were secondary. The primary signal was that the crew of the floating fortress was preparing to relax. The sheer size and symbolic nature of the ship meant any such event would be highly centralized, effectively pulling the entire senior command structure into a single, distracted location. The confirmation was the go signal. The tactical opportunity had arrived. The plan, which hinged entirely on human failure, could finally be executed. The intelligence was chillingly clear. The sailors and commanders of the high-value target were at that moment focused on ceremony and celebration, not the dark expanse of the water around them. A warship is a complex machine, but its effectiveness relies on its crew readiness. Under normal circumstances, the fortress required a continuous state of maximum alert. Multiple officers dedicated to radar monitoring, rapid response teams standing by the defense systems, and a constant, highly decentralized command and control (C2) structure. The celebration shattered this structure. Manning levels for non-critical stations were dropped. Operators were rotated off shifts early. The focus of the bridge shifted from threat assessment to protocol and ceremony. Crucially, the ship's OPSEC was fatally compromised. The very act of hosting a major event necessitated a reduction in electronic and physical security precautions. The key defensive weakness lay in the radar operators. The Neptune missile, flying just meters above the water, requires split-second recognition by human operators to be successfully intercepted. During a celebration, the operators remaining on duty were likely suffering from the effects of distraction, fatigue, or the simple psychological belief that they were safe. A slight delay in identifying the incoming missile, a sluggish response in activating the electronic warfare countermeasures. That delay was the window of execution. The underlying condition was simple complacency. The commanders of the Black Sea Fleet had grown accustomed to their own invulnerability. They had successfully navigated the coastal threat for months. They had survived, in their minds, the worst that Ukraine's limited resources could throw at them. They believed their distance from shore and their overwhelming firepower were sufficient shields. This arrogance was the true target of the Ukrainian strike. The planners recognized that an external threat, Even a missile can be defeated. But an internal threat, the relaxation of standards, the psychological letdown of the celebratory mood, is an invisible terminal defect. They had essentially done the Ukrainian planners' job for them. By choosing to celebrate in a potentially hostile environment, they had personally engineered the necessary conditions for their own defeat. Low vigilance, centralized command, and a crew distracted by internal affairs. The irony was devastating. As the Neptune missiles screamed silently across the waves, the atmosphere on the floating fortress was likely one of relief and high spirits. Speeches were being made, toasts raised, the sense of security absolute. They were within the protective bubble of their fleet's flagship, secure in their floating fortress. The final intelligence reports reached the Ukrainian launch teams. The celebration was at its peak. This was the moment. The missile's attack vector was finalized, its altitude locked at sea-skimming level. The decoy swarm began to activate, diverting the already relaxed attention of the vessel's diminished defensive crew. The psychological window was open. The tactical conditions were perfect. At this moment, a moment of Russian relaxation and revelry, the missiles, traveling at blinding speed, began the final, terminal phase of their journey. The party was about to be crashed in an act of spectacular, strategic retribution. In the middle of the celebratory atmosphere, the first alarms were likely belated and disorganized. The decoy effort had done its job, confusing the radar operators. The final approach of the high-speed, sea-skimming Neptune missiles was missed until the weapons were too close for the short-range defense systems to effectively engage. The first missile struck with concussive, shattering force, hitting the designated weak point, the flank below the waterline or near a critical system. The initial blast was a brutal shockwave. But the goal was not just to pierce the hull, it was to inflict catastrophic damage. The strategic placement of the strike immediately ignited the ship's internal combustibles. What followed was a massive secondary explosion, likely the result of the missile warhead penetrating the magazine area, fuel stores, or adjacent ammunition caches. The fortress, designed to be unsinkable, was now a tinderbox of its own arsenal. The blast ripped through the ship's internals, creating a devastating surge of heat and fire. Panic was immediate and absolute. The crew, seconds before celebrating, were now plunged into darkness, fire, and overwhelming smoke. The centralized command and control, C2 Center, a prime target, was likely rendered immediately inoperable. Senior commanders, distracted and centralized for the celebration, were either incapacitated or struggling to emerge from the chaos. Effective damage control on a warship requires calm, synchronized effort, and intact communication. On the floating fortress, both were shattered. Fire teams struggled to access compartments now engulfed in unmanageable flames. Water rushed into the breach, compounding the instability. Without central command, the ship descended into a nightmare of decentralized, desperate attempts to save the vessel. The ship's list, the angle it tilts in the water, grew rapidly. The sheer size of the vessel, typically its protection, now became a liability. The vast internal compartments provided the fire with endless fuel, and the weight of the incoming water threatened to overwhelm its structural integrity. The Russian response was immediate, but not to the strike itself. It was an information blackout. They attempted to deny the severity of the damage, initially claiming an onboard fire or storm damage. But the truth of a target this large cannot be concealed forever. As the vessel listed, Russian search and rescue ships were scrambled, desperate to save the crew and any critical intelligence. Meanwhile, Ukrainian and international OSINT, open-source intelligence, communities went to work. Satellite imagery, intercepted communications, and even distant civilian maritime reports began to paint a picture the Kremlin desperately tried to obscure. The sight of the listing flagship, the mighty symbol of Black Sea dominance, smoking and burning, became the ultimate proof. The ship was no longer a functional warship. It was a ruin, a floating testament to the price of complacency. Despite all efforts to save it, the inevitable occurred. The uncontrolled flooding, the rapid shift in the center of gravity, and the total destruction of its life support systems proved too much. The floating fortress, the ultimate expression of Russian naval power, slipped beneath the waves of the Black Sea. The sinking was more than a tactical loss. It was a strategic and psychological earthquake. It validated Ukraine's doctrine of asymmetric warfare and exposed a critical vulnerability in the heart of Russian military culture. The dangerous combination of overconfidence and a breakdown in discipline. Ukraine had waited for the moment of celebration, leveraging the enemy's temporary happiness against their most powerful machine. In doing so, they not only sank a ship, they fundamentally altered the balance of power in the Black Sea, turning a perceived Russian lake into a lethal battle space once more. The destruction of the floating fortress was a strategic watershed moment. Its sinking forced an immediate, fundamental strategic shift in Russia's naval operations. The remaining vessels of the Black Sea Fleet were no longer safe operating close to the Ukrainian coast. The primary tactical effect was the implementation of a new doctrine of deterrence by Ukraine. Russian ships were compelled to withdraw their operational zones further out to sea, dramatically increasing their distance from the shore. This significantly limited their ability to launch effective coastal artillery strikes and reduced the efficiency of the naval blockade. Crucially, the withdrawal created a viable security corridor that would ultimately prove vital for the continuation of the Black Sea grain corridor, allowing millions of tons of essential foodstuffs to reach the global market. The destruction of one ship had practical, humanitarian, and economic ramifications felt across the world. The naval threat had been pushed back, not by superior fleets, but by a superior intelligence-driven plan. Beyond the tactical gains, the operation was a massive win for psychological warfare. For Ukraine, it was proof that David could indeed defeat Goliath. It provided a monumental boost to national morale and demonstrated that even the most protected symbols of Russian aggression were not invulnerable. For the Russian Navy, the impact was corrosive. It was a spectacular public humiliation that exposed critical failures in command and control, discipline, and basic OPSEC. It sowed seeds of doubt among the crews of the remaining ships, who now understood that their largest, most powerful vessel was unable to defend itself when its human element failed. The celebration had turned into a permanent warning. The ultimate lesson of the attack on the floating fortress is a blueprint for the future of naval combat. It showcased the lethal effectiveness of asymmetric warfare when combined with relentless intelligence gathering. It proved that in the age of precision weaponry, the human factor, complacency, arrogance, or simply celebrating too soon, is the single greatest vulnerability of any complex, high-value military asset. Ukraine's forces didn't seek a fair fight. They sought an unbalanced one. They understood that the strongest defense systems can be bypassed if the men operating them are distracted. They waited patiently, not for a storm, but for a party. The sea is an unforgiving domain. And on that fateful night, the Black Sea consumed the floating fortress, teaching a devastating lesson in modern warfare. That sometimes the most effective weapon is not a missile, but a meticulously targeted, strategic wait for the enemy to celebrate their own safety.